Chapter 4. Existence. One of philosophy's fundamental problems since its inception has been to distinguish between being, which Aristotle was the first to seek to think qua being, and existence, qua a category that is precisely irreducible to the category of being. It is not exaggerated to say that the elaboration of this difference still dictates the destiny of a philosophical construction today. What is meant by the word existence frequently depends upon taking into consideration a special type of being. This is the case for Heidegger when he distinguishes between Sein and Dasein. From a strictly etymological point of view, existence, which depends on Dasein, can be observed to be a topological concept. It signifies being there, being in the world. That the broad concept of existence necessarily entails thinking the place, the world, where everything comes to be, or rather, to exist its being, is a determination that we obviously have to grant to Heidegger in the context of appearing as I define it. The inability to deduce this place from being as such is what founds the difference of Sein, Dasein, or being there. Yet for Heidegger, Dasein, and ultimately existence, is a name for human reality, the historical destiny of thought and the crucial creative experience of the becoming of being itself. I am going to propose, on the other hand, a concept of being there and of existence without making the slightest reference to anything like consciousness, experience, or human reality. From this point of view, I remain in the anti-humanist lineage of Althusser, Foucault, or Lacan. Existence is not a specific predicate of the human animal. In Sartre's work, the distance between being and existence is a dialectical consequence of the difference between being and nothingness. In fact, existence is the effect of nothingness within the ambit of the full, stupid massiveness of being qua being, and designates the complex relation between being in itself, which is consumed entirely in being without existing or going outside itself, and being for itself, which differs from itself by annihilating the in itself it potentially risks being. For my part, equally, the determination of the concept of existence is conditioned by something like negation as well as self-differing. Ontologically, this is, for me, the question of the void, the empty set. Phenomenologically, it is the question of negation in the various senses this can take, in classical, intuitionist, and paraconsistent logic, and as applicable to the appearing of a multiple if one measures the degree of identity between this and its negation in a world. But I will plot these connections without any relation whatsoever with the conscious subject, and even less, again, with freedom. Existence is not a specific predicate of the free subject or moral action. As has been seen, my thought of being there borrows something from Kant, namely, the fact that the appearing of a multiplicity presupposes the notion of a degree or intensity that measures the explicit relations between this multiplicity and all that co-appears in the same world. This idea is found in the famous passage from the First Critique, dealing with the anticipations of perception. But I am also going to borrow something from Hegel, namely that existence must be thought as the movement that goes from pure being to being there, or from essence to the phenomenon or appearing, as explained in two profound and obscure chapters of his logic. That said, I shall strive to bring to bear this limited array of loyalties, Heidegger, Sartre, Kant, and Hegel, without appealing to anything of the order of a historical notion of being, transparent consciousness, transcendental subject, or becoming of the absolute idea. This will equally allow me to recapitulate the steps we have taken so far. Let us set off from the question, what is a thing? This is the title of a famous essay by Heidegger. What is a thing qua a there is without any determination of its being, except precisely its being qua being? We can speak of an object of the world. We can distinguish it in the world by its properties or predicates. In fact, we can experiment with the complex network of identities and differences that render this object manifestly non-identical to another object of the same world. But a thing is not an object. A thing is not yet an object. Like the hero of Robert Musil's great novel, a thing is something without qualities. We need to think a thing before its objectivation in a specific world. The thing is das Ding, even perhaps das Urding, which is to say, that form of being that, while certainly situated after the indifference of nothingness, is nonetheless equally before the qualitative difference of the object. We must then formalize the concept of thing between the absolute priority of nothingness, the void out of which all multiplicities are woven, on the one hand, and the complexity of objects on the other. A thing is always the pre-objective basis of objectivity. This is the reason why a thing is nothing other than a multiplicity. Not a multiplicity of objects, not a system of qualities or network of differences, but a multiplicity of multiplicities, and a multiplicity of multiplicities of multiplicities, and so on. Is there an end to this type of dissemination, as Jacques Derrida would have put it? Yes, there is an endpoint, but this endpoint is not a primitive object or an atomic component. It is not a form of the one. The endpoint is also necessarily a multiplicity. This multiplicity is the multiplicity of no multiplicity, the thing which is also nothing, the void, the empty multiplicity, the empty set. The reason a thing is between indifference and difference, nothingness and objectivity, is because a pure multiplicity is composed of the void. The multiple as such has to do with difference and pre-objectivity. The void has to do with indifference and the total absence of any object. Since the work of Cantor at the end of the 19th century, we have known that it is perfectly rational to propose this type of construction of pure multiplicities starting from the void as the framework for mathematics. This is the origin and justification of the thesis I evoked above, according to which, if ontology is the science of the thing, of the pure something, then we must conclude that ontology is mathematics. The thing is formalized as a set. The elements of this set are sets, and the starting point for the entire construction is the empty set. It is at this point, on the path leading to existence, that the problem arises for us of understanding how objectivity originates. How can a pure multiplicity, a set, appear in a world, in a highly complex network of differences, identities, qualities, intensities, and so on? It is impossible to deduce something of this kind from the mathematical theory of multiplicities as sets of sets, composed ultimately of the pure void. If ontology, as the theory of things without qualities, is mathematics, then phenomenology, as the theory of appearing and objectivity, concerns the relation between qualitative differences or problems of identities, and this is where we encounter problems of existence. All of this requires thinking a place for appearing, or for being there, a place that we call a world, and which, for its part, does not exist given it is the condition of all existence. After the mathematics of being qua being, we have set about developing in our previous chapters the logic of worlds. Unlike the logic of things, which are composed of sets, it is impossible for the logic of worlds to be purely extensional. This logic must be that of the distribution of intensities within the field in which multiplicities are not merely limited to being, but equally appear there in a world. The law of things is to be qua pure multiplicities, as things, but equally to be there qua appearing, as objects. The rational science pertaining to the first point is ontology, historically unfolded as mathematics. The rational science of the second point is logical phenomenology, in a more Hegelian than Husserlian sense. Against Kant, we must maintain that we know being qua being, just as we no less know the way in which the thing in itself appears in a world. The mathematics of multiplicities and the logic of worlds designate, were we to adopt Kant's terminology, our first two critiques. The third critique consists of the theory of the event, truth, and the subject, an outline of which is given in this book from chapter 5 onwards, and is what any contemporary philosophy worthy of the name takes as its veritable goal, to answer the question, how are we to live such that our life measures up to the idea? In all of this, existence is a general category of the logic of appearing, belonging to the second critique, and can be discussed independently of any consideration of subjectivity. At this stage of our argument, existence is to remain an asubjective concept. Suppose we have a pure multiplicity, a thing, which can be formalized as a multiple or set. We want to understand what exactly the appearing or being there of this thing in a given world is. According to the idea set out in chapters 2 and 3, when the thing, the set, is localized in a world, this is because the elements of the set are inscribed within a completely new evaluation of their identities. It becomes possible to state that such and such an element, for example, X, is more or less identical to another element, for example, Y. In classical ontology, there are only two possibilities. Either X is the same as Y, or it is not at all identical to Y. You have either strict identity or difference. Inversely, in a concrete world, as the place of multiplicities being there, we have a great variety of possibilities. A thing can be very similar to another, or similar in certain points and different by way of others, or somewhat identical, or very identical but not entirely the same, and so on. As a result, any element of a thing can be put into relation with others by what we call a degree of identity. The fundamental characteristic of a world is the distribution of this type of degree over all the differences that appear in this world. Accordingly, the concept of appearing, or being there, or world, itself possesses two characteristics. First, there must be a system of degrees with an elementary structure, rendering the comparison of degrees possible. We must be capable of observing if a given thing is more identical to such and such another than to a third. For this reason, degrees evidently have the formal structure of an order. They admit, perhaps within the compass of certain limits, more and less. This structure is the rational disposition of the infinite hues of a concrete world. I would recall that I have named this organization of degrees of identity the transcendental of a world. As for the second characteristic, this consists of a relation between things, multiplicities, and degrees of identity, which is precisely the meaning of being in a world for a thing. Once equipped with these two determinations, we would then have the signification of the becoming object of the thing, followed by that of its existence. Let us repeat the construction of what we will from now on call an object, namely a multiple associated with an evaluation of the identities and differences immanent to it. Suppose we have a couple of elements of a multiple that appears in a world. To these elements there corresponds a degree of identity, such that this expresses the more or less identity between the two elements of this world. As a result, a degree in the transcendental of the world will correspond to any two elements. We name this relation an identity function. Such an identity function, operative between certain multiplicities and the transcendental of the world, is in fact the fundamental concept of the logic of being there or appearing. If a pure multiplicity is a thing, a multiplicity accompanied by its degree of identity is an object of the world. Thus, the complete logic of objectivity consists in the study, on the one hand, of the form of the transcendental as a structural order, and on the other, of the identity function between multiplicities and the transcendental. Formally consisting in the study of types of structural order, the study of the transcendental is a technical issue involving formal fragments of a mathematical, logical nature, and interplay with a fundamental philosophical intuition. As for the study of the identity function, this comes down to examining an important philosophical problem, namely that of the relation between things and objects, or, in other words, between indifferent multiplicities and their concrete being there. Here, I would simply like to consider 3 points. First, it is very important to keep in mind that there are many types of orders and, consequently, many possibilities for the logical organization of a world. We must assume the existence of an infinity of different worlds. Not simply on an ontological level, a multiplicity, a thing, is in a world and not another, but equally on a logical level, that of appearing, and thereby also, as we will see, of existence. Two worlds with the same things can be absolutely different from each other, because their transcendentals are different. That is, the identities between the elements of the same multiplicity can radically differ on the level of their being there in a world or in another. Second, as we have seen, there is always in a world a certain number of limits to appearing's intensity. A degree of identity between two elements varies between two limit cases, such that the two elements can be absolutely identical or practically indiscernible within the logical framework of a world. Or they can be absolutely non-identical, absolutely different from each other, with no point in common. Between these two limits, the identity function can express the fact that the two elements are neither absolutely identical nor absolutely different. This idea is easily formalized. In a transcendental order, you have a minimal degree and a maximal degree of identity. Most often, you have a great number of intermediary degrees. When the identity function for a couple of elements in a world takes the maximal value, the two elements will be said to be absolutely identical in this world or to have the same appearing, the same being there. When the identity function takes the minimal value, the two elements will be said to be absolutely different from each other, while in the case of an identity function taking an intermediary value, the two elements will be said to be identical to a certain extent, with this extent indicated by this intermediary transcendental degree. Third, in addition to its order encompassing its maximum and minimum, a transcendental has structural laws that we can think by the means of logic, and which lead us to speak in a more precise manner of an object's global determinations. We can, for example, examine the intensity of the being there of a part of the world, even if this is infinite, rather than that of just a few elements. Or we can develop a theory of the smallest parts of an object, which I name atoms of appearing. An absolutely crucial principle comes into play in this theory, which I name the fundamental principle of materialism. The statement of this principle is very simple. Any atom of appearing is real. This indicates that at the atomic level, that is, when what is involved is a single element of the multiple that appears, the atom of appearing can be identified with a real element of the multiple in question. In the ontological sense, this element belongs to it. We are engaged here in the most profound reflections on the connections between ontology and logic, between being and appearing. By adopting the principle of materialism, we admit that at appearing's minimal point, there is a sort of fusion with the being that appears. An atom of appearing is in a certain way prescribed by a real element of the multiple. Unfortunately, while the principle is simple to state, its formalization and rigorous examination exceed the scope of our manifesto. What is to be kept in mind, however, is that any authentic philosophy of appearing is declared here to be materialist in the sense of this principle. In my first manifesto, I wrote that philosophy, reuniting with the theme of truth, must assume a Platonic gesture. The second manifesto declares that what is now on the agenda, with all its requisite conceptual rigor, is a Platonic materialism, which will be seen later on to be a materialism of the idea. We have then an extensive and demanding comprehension of what happens to a multiplicity when it really appears in a world, or when it is not simply reducible to its pure, immanent composition. Multiplicities that appear must be understood as highly complex networks of degrees of identity between their elements, parts, and atoms. This is what, in Logics of Worlds, I name atomic logic, and it forms the most subtle part of the theory of appearing. It demands an attention to the logic of qualities, and not solely to the mathematicity of extensions. Beyond pure multiple being, we have to think something like an existential intensity. This brings us to the point we wanted to get to. How do we set about defining existence within the transcendental framework of appearing, or being there? I will immediately signal my conclusion. Existence is the name proper to the value of the identity function when this is applied to one and the same element. It is, so to speak, the measure of the identity of a thing to itself. Given a world and an identity function taking its values in the transcendental of this world, that which we are going to name the existence of a multiple appearing in this world is the transcendental degree assigned to this multiplicity's self-identity. So defined, existence is a category not of being, mathematics, but of appearing, logic. This entails, in particular, that to exist is meaningless in itself. In keeping with Heidegger's insight, which both Sartre and Merleau-Ponty were to take up, it is only possible to speak of existing in relation to a world. The fact is that existence is a transcendental degree indicating the intensity of a multiplicity's appearing in a given world, and this intensity is in no way prescribed by the pure composition of the multiplicity under consideration. We can apply to existence the formal remarks made above if, for example, the degree of identity of a multiple to itself is the maximal degree. This multiple exists in the world without any limitation. In this world, the multiplicity completely affirms its own identity. Symmetrically, if this degree is the minimal degree, this multiple does not exist in this world. The multiple thing is in the world, but with an intensity equal to zero. Its existence is a non-existence. The thing is in the world, but its appearing in the world is the destruction of its identity. Thus, the being there of this being is to be an inexistent of the world. Often, the existence of a multiplicity in a world is neither maximal nor minimal. The multiplicity exists to a certain extent. The powerful plane tree of Valéry's poem is given as a complete, unquestionable existence. Its existential affirmation knows no limits. It can be said to offer itself up to the world, absolutely identical to itself, and all the more affirmative for the fact that its candor is bound by the force of the sight. In the fleeting world of a car's headlights, on the other hand, the tree, whose merely fugitive presence, quasi-identical to any other, fades like a shadow the very instant it appears, possesses a degree of self-identity, and thus of individual existence that is weak, though not nil. It is a case of intermediary existence. Finally, while the daydreamer, reclining between two trees, is vaguely aware of the presence of the other surrounding trees as a blurred haze behind the leaves she is so intently gazing at. This presence is nonetheless endowed with a minimal self-identity through lack of individuation, there being no shape etched out against the sunlit backdrop by way of which to evaluate it. Any one plane tree within this surrounding, rippling blur is an inexistent of the world. The theory of inexistence is highly important since, as we shall see in the next chapter, the fact that there are inexistents renders it necessary for events to occur which drastically change the relation, at a local level, between the multiples of a world and the transcendental legislation of their immanent identities and differences. At the core of this theory is a veritable metaphysical theorem. Theorem because it can be demonstrated using the slightly formalized version of the logic of appearing. Metaphysical because it consists of a statement that intimately links the appearing of a multiplicity and the non-appearance of an element of that multiplicity. Metaphysical also in that this theorem is conditional upon the fundamental principle of materialism that I mentioned above, and depends therefore on an orientation in thought that is a philosophical choice and not the result of an argument. This theorem can be stated very simply as follows. If a multiplicity appears in a world, one element of this multiplicity, and one alone, is an inexistent of this world. It should be noted that the inexistent is not distinguished ontologically. It is not in any way that nothing of multiple being that is the void. To inexist is an existential distinction and thereby exclusively internal to appearing. The inexistent is simply that of which the self-identity is measured in a given world by the minimal degree. Let's give an imposing and well-known example. In Marx's analyses of bourgeois or capitalist societies, the proletariat is the inexistent peculiar to political multiplicities. It is that which does not exist. This in no way means that it has no being. Marx did not for a second think that the proletariat had no being, since he was, on the contrary, to pile up volume after volume in the aim of explaining what it is. There is no doubting the social and economic being of the proletariat. Rather, what was doubtful has always been doubtful, and is so today more than ever, is its political existence. The proletariat is completely subtracted from the sphere of political presentation. The multiplicity it is can be analyzed, but according to the rules governing the appearance of the political world, it does not appear within this. It is there, but with the minimal degree of appearance, namely degree 0. It is obviously what the Internationale proclaims. We are nothing, let us be all. What does we are nothing mean? Those proclaiming we are nothing are not in the process of affirming their nothingness. They are simply affirming that they are nothing in the world as it is, as far as appearing politically is involved. From the point of view of their political appearing, they are nothing. Becoming all presupposes then a change of world, which is to say, a change of transcendental. The transcendental has to change in order for the assignation to existence, and thus the inexistent as a multiplicity's point of non-appearing in a world, to change in its turn. Similarly, until Italian algebraists invented a systematic way of handling imaginary numbers, the square root of a negative real number was assigned a nil degree of self-identity because of its prohibition by the transcendental legislation of the world calculation on real numbers. Such a square root is a conceptual inexistent of this world. Here, again, a mutation in the world of calculation was necessary for it to be possible, once the transcendental regulation of existence had locally changed, to write the symbol I as the mark of existence of the square root of -1. The demonstration of the existence and unicity of the inexistent for any multiple that exceeds to appearing or being there goes beyond the scope of this book. I would insist on the fact that it depends on the axiom of materialism, namely that any atom is real. Perhaps one should see in this dependence a dialectical statement. If the world is determined at the level of the one, or atomic level, by a materialist prescription of the type appearing equals being, then negation is in the form of an element struck by inexistence. This point attests to both the gap between being and existence, and the fact that this gap concentrates by virtue of the clause of unicity the power of appearing of the multiple it affects, which in turn clarifies the bond, centered on the inexistent at the scale of which will become evident later on, between a multiple of the world and the power immanent to this multiple of the consequences incurred when this is struck by an event. From this point of view, the doctrine of truths that I am proposing can legitimately claim to adhere to a materialist dialectic.